Okay, so we're going to be talking about Java graphical user interfaces. And our agenda is that we're going to be mostly working with JavaFX. We're going to be discussing a couple of things regarding the history and some of the philosophy of programming in graphical user interfaces. And I hope you will find this video useful. Okay, so what is JavaFX? JavaFX is the heir to the throne of graphical user interface programming in Java. There's been a few attempts that have been improved throughout time, and since Java has been around since the 90s. So when Java launched, the entire idea was that you could run applications on your browser, and back then, they're less so now, and I think that even some browsers actually prohibit the use of applets. But back then, you could run what it was called an applet, and that is just basically a tool that would allow you to run an application in your browser. This was before really going too much onto the server side of applications. People were thinking that you could write full applications that would just run in your browser as a plugin. And Java provided out of the box a toolkit for making these tools, and that was known as the Java Abstract Window Toolkit. And basically, it just provided like very basic stuff, buttons, text fields, things like that. But it actually was quite ugly. You couldn't really customize it. It had like some really weird colors, and because it was intended to run on the browser, it was just I don't know, it was not too, the applications were not really exciting. And as we know, just graphical interfaces, if they're attractive, people will use them more. Anyway, the second attempt was Java Swing, which was more aimed towards making it with custom look and feel as compared to AWT. So it was like for them it was like a bigger deal. It had more of a consistent behavior, and it was so different computers would actually react more consistent to it, and it was more performant. However, as applications has been evolving more, and now we have even certain other devices that are touch screens or mobile devices or things like that. The Java guys decided that they would add a third version of their graphical user interface called JavaFX. And the entire difference between that, or one of the key differences, was that you could skin it through CSS, allowing people to create better looking interfaces by using known descriptors such as CSS and essentially grabbing some elements from HTML from that, or the syntax from that. The idea is also that you can, and hence the name, is that you could add some special effects, and it would be also supporting. It would be supported through different devices. So let's just grab a couple basic concepts of JavaFX. So JavaFX, it defines things as different components, and you have the application, the stage, and the scene. The application is essentially the abstract thing that holds the entire but when you have multiple windows, actually makes sense that there's a component that is holding a reference to all the windows that are open. An application that might have multiple windows open might be a browser. You might have a different browser rather than multiple tabs. And the application, or the process, the thing that is keeping the process alive and the reference to the entire thing, is the application. After that, then we have the stage. The stage is the top level container that defines the space. That's a very formal definition. The easiest way to remember that is the window, and that's going to be the stage. And inside of the stage, there is the screen. So if I was going to just show you more or less, uh, the entire process holding, keeping Keynote alive in here is the application. The stage is my entire window, and the scene is the actual contents of the window. It is kind of like an important distinction, because that's what gives you better control and better division about things. So one of the key ingredients in programming graphical user interfaces is that you have to divide things as much as possible into into units that make sense, that you're not overloading one single piece of code to do way too much. So that's why we're defining and splitting things out in a hierarchy that makes sense. Our first Java app, and we're just going to create a traditional Java class. And I'm going to encourage you, because right now it's a virtual class rather than a classroom class where I can just leave enough time for you guys to copy, to pause the video often. And I may include some parts where I would like you to pause and really read and look at how things are looking. So this is just a good reminder of that. Okay, so we're going to start with our class that is going to be called Hello World FX. Why? Because we're using JavaFX. And at this point you may be like, okay, so this thing looks just like any traditional class. Absolutely, it just looks like that. But what I would like to do, just close this process. So what I would like to do is then to do that it extends application. And right now, since it's giving me, if I just continue like that, it's gonna complain, and then I'm gonna have to do the traditional Alt-Enter. Mac and Windows are different. Okay, so I can then say that I'm gonna import the JavaFX application, and it's still in red. So I'm going to ask you to pause it here so you can read the error that by putting my mouse over that, what is telling. Okay, so you might have noticed that it's asking for certain methods to be implemented or be kept as abstract. And the reason for that is that the application Java application is an abstract class. Any guesses why? Well, the reason is because if I go into my Hello World and use Alt-Enter, I can implement the methods, and it's requiring this start method. And this takes us to our lifecycle part of the process. So it requires this start method, and if we were to do like a public static void main string args, and we did system.out.println, and we can say something like it's launched, we're going to see that if we run it, it's going to run just like any other Java application. Why? Because this was the entry point, but nothing made it to the start of this, to the start function. Just like we did with threading, that you had run and then it would call this other function. Here, you would need a special function that you need to call to start the actual application loop. And we're going to go through that in a second of the explanation of the life cycle. But if we call the launch args, we pass this guys into here, it's going to end up going here. So if we do system.out.println and we call it started, we're going to see two things. One, that it starts this started it prints this because the launch function called some other methods to set up the entire application, and those methods in turn called our start method, and it passed us a stage as the main stage or the first stage to use. And then you will also notice that the line launched was never called. And that is because everything is looping here on the launch part of things. It's just waiting for things to be clicked. It's just waiting for things to be moved, for things to be typed. So this is the first part of graphical user interface programming that is very different than our linear programming mechanisms, where you call function 1, then function 2, then function 3, and then that's over. Here we're actually in this endless loop waiting for something to happen. In this case, we're really not doing anything. So I think it's a good time to segue into the life cycle of the application. Okay, so what is the application loop? The application loop is when you start. This leads us to the conversation of what is the life cycle of the application. The life cycle of the application is basically what happens from the beginning until the end of the application. So the launch function is called, and that runs an internal init function, and then that triggers the start method to be running on a loop. So it's essentially keeping the application loop running and listening for things. That's why you can have an application running forever, and then until you close it, that's when it finishes. And then once it finishes, it calls the stop method. So if we were going to look at the details of this, for example, okay, so going back to our code here, I am going to comment this line out, and essentially just I am getting already a stage, and the stage, remember that it's a window, so I can do it like stage or primary stage dot show. And this thing is basically the most, you can see that there's an application essentially running, really not doing anything because I am not, oh, it actually popped here. So there's our stage being shown. If I close it, it will exit the loop, the application loop, and this line launched will be printed and the process will finish. So if we were then going to do like primary stage, since the stage is a window, we can do like set title, and they call it stage probably just to keep it abstract, so that way things are not only tied to window only to systems. So you can, for example, an iPhone or an Android or other, mobile devices don't really have windows per se. They do have applications, but they're not really like opening and closing windows. So they try to keep it probably more abstract. But let's go back into our setting the title for this. I mean, they could have easily probably called it window and it would have been fine. But now we can see that the process that it launched has a hello world title, and the application finished its purpose. All right, so if we're going to, we already saw a window with a little nice title, and then the question is, okay, that's great. How do I start adding other things that are important? So let's talk about the things that happen inside of the scene. So much the same way that we had our application and stage and scene, here we have another type of hierarchy. And most importantly, you will see that there's just nodes inside of the scene. And inside of the scene, you could have layouts, which could be just defining how things are going to appear in a natural flow in the entire application, and I will show you later in the video how those work. And then we can have other control items like a button, a slider, a spinner, a text line, groups, which are other types of nodes. So we were just talking a second ago about layout. And there are different ways where you can define how things are going to lay out. And most importantly, let's see, you can actually make it either a flow pane. That means that if you have multiple nodes, how they are being added. So it could be like number one. Let me just, so you can see the clicks, number one, then number two, then number three. And if the window is long enough, then you could have a 4, 5, whatever. But if the window is not long enough, then it goes into a new line and it's 4, 5, 6, and it would continue doing like a flow. Another one would be a grid pane, where you can actually, every time that you add an item, it would know to go and add it to the next one. So if we go into one, it would be like the first one, the second item, the third item, the fourth item. And it doesn't matter if you resize a window or not. The grid pane won't change. That's the difference, the key difference between the grid pane and the flow pane. The flow pane might want to choose how many are it per row, just given, you know, the width, and it knows like, okay, well, all these guys have a certain, say if it had 25%, I could probably put 4 elements, and here it won't matter. Doesn't matter if you have like 80 or 60 or whatever as the width or the height. It would always put them on, it would divide the entire area of the window as 4 by 4, and here it would be just more flowing. Okay, so we've got our really cool, cute little window that tells us that something is going to run, and it has the title, and it's an empty window. So what if we want to do something else with it? What if we want to add, I don't know, a button or a text field? The main thing is that we need to, given our structure that we had here, we have a scene, a node, and multiple nodes inside of it. So what we need to create is, first of all, the scene and the root node that is going to contain our buttons. So right now, I don't want to worry about layout, so I'm just going to create a group, and we're going to call it the root. And that's going to be the root node equals new group. And if we want to fix this, we're going to select it from JavaFX scene, and then we're going to create also a scene equals and the scene is just essentially what is going to hold the entire contents of the window. So we can create new scene, and we're going to add via Alt Enter import the 2 packages, and still the constructor is just telling us that it needs something. So it actually needs the root node, and then in that, then okay, so now we have essentially the same thing. It's just that invisibly we have something like this. So yeah, what we would end up with would be with something that will look more or less, this is my version of the whiteboard. So we will end up with something that we will have a hierarchy where the application is this. We will have basically the scene and then the root. In all fairness, if we wanted to visualize it as a tree, more like this, where we would have the app, we would have the app, the scene, the app, and our code is showing that we would have also the stage, which is a window. We would have then the scene, which is where the components are kept, and then you would have uh, node, a node or nodes. You can have many if you want. And then inside of that you can have a series of nodes that could be but in this case right now, if we wanted to, let's see that this is a red, that what this app is app stage scene root node, and we're gonna add a button. Okay, so more or less like our hierarchy of components would look like this. And I think I need to re-record that because I did screw that up. Okay, so let's just okay, so let's assume that we have our hierarchy, that it's the application, the stage, which is a window. Then we'll have the scene, which is the everything from, in this window, you can see that there's the window itself, that it has the black bar of this QuickTime video that it's capturing what my tablet is doing, that I'm using as a whiteboard. The scene is basically the thing that is gonna hold every single component, and there we have let me just delete this thing so that way it's clear. There we will have a root component. So we will have a root component there that will be essentially a node, and then from there on we can have, or even from this point we could have more nodes, and it could be like a crazy hierarchy where you could be just essentially adding more node, and then so you can be adding like parent child, parent child, parent child. But typically in a scene, it's the one that holds everything. And this might be confusing because you see a lot of steps down in this direction. But typically in a scene, that's the one that it's essentially holding everything. The root node is a layout, meaning that it's going to dictate how things get aligned and how things get inserted into the entire hierarchy of components. In this app, I'm going to draw it in red. We're going to have our app, then we're going to have our stage, which is the first child. That is essentially the window again. And then under that, we have the scene, and I'm just going to create a root component, which is going to be of the type group. And then I'm just going to add a node, which is going to be a button. Okay? All right, so if I was going to move this here for a second, so I created that root and the scene. You can see how the scene received the root. So essentially, the scene received the root in this direction. Then we can say root dot. Come on, we'll give it a get children dot add, and we're gonna generate a new button equals new button, and we know now that this thing is complaining because it doesn't know what kind of button it is. We don't have anything defined, so the easiest thing to do is Alt Enter, and that is going to import the class, and it's gonna request either AWT, which is the old school one, so we don't ever want to mix AWT with JavaFX, and since we're learning JavaFX, we're going to use that one. And now we can then add that button to the children hierarchy of the group. So essentially we're trying to get the children. This is, if we did this, and this is, you can't see with this, get children. And remember that there could be many. So this is our get children, and then that's where we add the button. So if we wanted to run this, now we have a very beautiful app. I think it's going to put it on my other monitor when it launches. Where did it go? Where? Oh, yes. One thing that we need to tell it so that it's just not sitting somewhere in there. Let's just stop this guy for a sec. We're going to tell it the width and height of the scene. So let's say that we're going to put it like 300 and 300 pixels. Again, one of the things that I would like to highlight that it's always kind of confusing for people is that they see these things on the editor where there's a width, height, text, and those are not really part of the text. You can see that I'm trying to select it and it's not even there. These are just named parameters that the text editor is trying to just highlight what is the variable that it's going to receive, and those are coming from these values. You can see that that function, that constructor is defined as the parent, double width, and double height. So it's essentially trying to label this guy so that way you know what kind of parameters they are. Same thing for this guy. This is not really text that we ever try to spell, and I would like just to make some extra emphasis because it seems to be that is usually like a point where people get confused about. So let's launch this guy. And see, yes, I know why. So we're not seeing it because typically we need to also, this is something that I'm being a little silly, we need to tell the primary stage to be shown. Typically when you are creating a window, you have to essentially draw everything for efficiency and then display the actual window. So it is drawing now here, but now I would like to troubleshoot why my scene is not showing. And if we were going to look at this code right here, we can see that the scene, it is not connected to the stage. So we need to primary stage dot set scene, and we're going to connect our scene. You see how I'm trying, like, essentially what didn't exist, or the way that the app was wired was, let's just delete all this extra noise, all these extra things. That the way that the app was wired, it was essentially written that way. So what we are doing with this line is essentially we're drawing that connection, this connection. It's what we're drawing. So with this line, it's essentially doing this line is essentially doing that connection. So if we are going to run it, and I hope it doesn't go to the other monitor. Not, I'll just drag it here. Where did it go? Here it is. And you can see that there's a test button added to this. Okay, let me move this. Let me clear the window so that way you can see the code. I'm gonna let it sit down here so that you can make a pause and look at the actual code and try to understand a little bit more how it's all connected. Okay, so now we told you more or less how you can add certain controls, but I'm not telling you exactly how to make it look a little bit better, how to get things to work in general, just cooler. So I want to just highlight a couple things. So everything, since you are drawing everything before you even show it, you have the capacity of, since we saw, like, if we rerun this guy and we see that the window that executes this thing, where did it go? Takes a little bit. So you can see that it's all, you know, against this edge of the corner of the window. We can start modifying some of that stuff, and just by adding a dot, it tells us where what kind of things we have. We can also always review the API, and just as an example, I can just go into Google and say, actually I had the JavaFX scene here, and see in how you could essentially add a control, or what are essentially the things that you can create. So if, for example, if I want to search, I typically use the search JavaFX and say button, and it's going to return me the Oracle documentation, and that's essentially what I'm looking for. And here I can see like there's all these methods that are either inherited from multiple things or displayed from this class itself. So for example, if I do dot, you can see that there are a bunch of methods here. So let's say that I'm gonna just essentially set, usually there's like setters, so I can actually say that I'm gonna set the border of the button to like 10. Let's see, border value. Let's see if that's, oh no, it receives a new border object. For simplicity, I mean, I could add that, but let's see, set set layout, and I'm gonna separate it 10 pixels from the beginning where it was supposed to be, and 10 pixels in X, 20 pixels in Y. So if I run it, you're gonna see how it draws the button, and then essentially each one of these guys is reading, okay, now move it 10 pixels to the right, and then now move it 20 pixels to the bottom, add it, and then show it. And you're gonna see that it's saying 20 pixels below. You can see that the space from here to here is bigger than here to here. It's essentially twice the size. So you can see how this thing is just receiving very specific instructions on how to draw something. Okay, so now let's try to play a little bit with layouts and understand them a little bit better. So I'm going to remove some of these things except for my scene itself. Okay, I'm gonna right now, when I remove all that, this guy, the root, becomes as a problem because there's no variable named root. So I'm going to just create like a flow pane, just to compare flow panes, flow or layout equals new flow pane. And if we add this thing, if we add the and we're going to make it orientation dot vertical, because this is one way that you can do your pane. So let's just say that we're gonna create a bunch of maybe a bunch of labels, and so let's say that we're going to add int equals 0. We're gonna add 10 labels, okay, and we're gonna add those labels. They're gonna have 1 2 3 4 5 for int I equals 0. So we're gonna add those to the layout. Okay, so we're gonna be like layout dot get children dot, actually we can just say that we're gonna create a label and we're gonna say that we're gonna create 10 labels this way. have an array of 10 labels, and then labels, and we're gonna attach a new label with the title I. We're gonna okay, so we're creating 10 labels, and then in the layout we're gonna get children, and we're gonna add all and labels. So we're gonna add all the labels using a flow pane. Where did it go? So we can see that in a flow pane, it essentially try to fit as much in a vertical way that it was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's try to do it in a horizontal way. Oh, yeah, I don't want this. I don't want that. Now let's just to compare how our just the layout of the flow pane actually affects things. And now you can see that it was reorganizing things in a horizontal way. So we can technically see how when I resize the window, it moves them from the 7 to the 8 to the 9. So this is a little bit more like mobile friendly, you know, for those of you that do Java development. But let's make sure that, you know, each one of these labels, let's edit it a little bit. Let's make sure that these labels have, I don't know, l.set font, and let's just new font, and obviously we're going to have to import the class, and let's see what would be a we can do like a font of like 20. It's a size 20. We're gonna make it a little bit bigger, just that way we can see very clearly how this thing is helping us to create like a flow that it's horizontal by going like this, a little bit bigger. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then you can see that dynamically it allocates that. And the same thing goes then for vertical, which is something that we had seen before, but I just want to show how this would work. Zero, 1, 2, 3. So it's doing this flow like that. So I can essentially put it all one line or like that, and it tries to reassign 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's super interesting with a flow pane layout what this thing is going to do. But not all the time we want one of these layouts, as much as sometimes we do, so that way, you know, if you make the window like small, you can readjust. But sometimes you do want something like a table that has more or less like an Excel structure, and you may need another different type of layout. And for that type of layout, there's something called the grid pane layout. And it requires no constructor. So now if we were going to do this thing, we have control of on which column and which row we we are going to add things. So rather than creating this array of labels, it's more about where we're going to tell the grid to add. Oh, let's just, sorry, layout dot add. In this case, because it's a grid layout, we can say that we're going to add this new label in a column. Let's say we're going to need like a way to say this is column and then column, and then we're going to have to do it again because we're going to have to do columns and rows. So we're going to have to do int row equals 0 until the row is less than 5. Let's see. And then row plus plus. And actually, let's make a 5 by 5 matrix. So we're going to say we're going to create like a value of column. This is the same code that I had before, and then we're going to just put the coordinates something here. And actually, we're going to create a string where we're putting a string, 2 strings, and then we're just going to put the column and the row. But this code looks a little ugly, so we're going to, well, first of all, replace this thing with the text that is going to go in, which is our message. And then to keep everything more or less readable, we can do something like this. We add spaces. You can see how the code becomes a little bit more readable. You know that this is my message that was created from a format that is string comma string, where we were putting row and column. So essentially, since we need to add to the layout, we can do column comma row, and let's just remove extra lines that were left over from manipulating this thing. So now this is our code. It looks pretty. And now we can see how it's all drawn, and doesn't matter how we are doing it, is 0 0, and actually let's just maybe add extra spaces. So let's redo this thing so that way there's a little bit of extra notation where things happen. So now you can see 0 1 1 0 2 0 because we've made it like probably these values are, let's see, column index and row index. So probably I actually went, in order to make it like, yes, it's row. Essentially I would have to do something like this, just flipping those 2 lines just so that it makes more sense coherently, the coordinates, how it's 0 0 0 1 0 2 0 3, etc. And then second row would be 1 0 1 1 1 2 1 3. Yes. So you can see how I'm resizing the window, and it doesn't really affect anything. So this is a different thing where you actually need to just place coordinates of each one of these guys in. Cool. Let's pause here so that way you can take a look at the code and do any comparisons that you need to.